Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. And on the bench today, we have a 2007 Can Am 500 engine. We're going to reassemble it top to bottom. It's going to take a little bit of time, so grab yourself a cold drink, hot coffee, meet me back here, and let's get started. And we are going to start right here at the crankshaft. If you guys watched the previous video where I tore this thing down, the reason that it seized up was because these main bearings, you can actually see that this one here has got a lot of material buildup, actually stopped right here at the journal. So upon further inspection, I originally thought we were going to have to send this thing out and get it all redone, but turns out it's not actually that bad. And I have a trick up my sleeve, which is right over here. This stuff right here works miracles on old bearing material. I got this stuff at Home Hardware. This is muriatic acid, and you're going to use it, of course, wearing gloves. You're going to wear all the proper PPE, which is also going to be your glasses. You're going to use an acid brush like this. You're going to simply put a little bit of this on there, and you're going to watch it bubble. And I highly recommend wearing a respirator or doing this maybe outside or in a well-ventilated area, because this stuff is really bad, highly toxic, but it really does a job. I mean, it gets rid of all this stuff, and once we got all this nice and clean, we're going to polish it up a little bit with some nice fine sandpaper, put some new bearings in, and then start by assembling the connecting rods. And actually, look at this. Connecting rods don't have any damage whatsoever. You can actually still see some of the hash marks in there from when they were turned. And something too that you guys may not have known, but these connecting rods are what you call fractured connecting rods. So that's why these lines look all, well, weird, because they actually build them in one piece and they fracture them so that they meet together perfectly. Okay, so after spending a little bit of time with that muriatic acid and a little brush, this is what the end product looks like. I mean, looks pretty darn good to me. So we're going to measure this. We're going to make sure that it's not out of round. And if it is, well, it needs to be reworked anyways. But I already have measured this. We're in good shape. So I finished off with a fine sandpaper, like a 220 grit or so. So we're going to put this aside for now, because what we're going to do now is we're going to concentrate on putting on the case gasket. So before I like to put on a case gasket, I like to take a little bit of RTV sealant and in the corners, just to hold it in place, around the dowels. So we're going to put it on, and then make sure it's onto the alignment dowels. There we are. And we're going to wait a little bit of time for this thing to set. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put on the connecting rods onto that crankshaft, torque them up, and we'll see you with the crank halves put together. So before putting anything together, I like to put the piston rings on now because there's a little bit more room to play. But before you can put them onto the pistons, something you should always do, and check this out, this is how you get them from BRP. They're actually in a nice little package. They tell you which ring is the oil control, the center ring, and then the top piston ring. But like I was saying, what you need to do is you always need to check the ring end gap. And the ring end gap is by using the cylinder. The cylinder, you're going to be using the rings in, because you don't want to use just any cylinder. You're going to put the ring in place. You're going to put it down, and I like to use the piston to push it down square. And then right down here, this little gap is what you're going to be measuring. Now you're going to follow what the manual says, and you're going to do that with every ring, making sure that it's okay. And you're going to adjust it by either opening up that gap if it's too tight. And of course, note that on these rings it says top, and of course, well, that faces the top. Okay, so now it's time to bolt the two halves together. If you guys remember the last video, we had one smaller screw, so I'm going to start with that one, which is located over on this side. Get that one in place. We're going to drop screws everywhere in the meantime. I'm not going to torque them just yet, but I'm going to just put them all the way down and then go around and torque them. So now it's time to install the cylinder. Now before we do this, there's really no easy way to do the cylinders on this particular engine because the cylinders actually run right into the crankcase. But what we do need to do is we need to trim off the excess gasket that we cut off earlier, flush with the mating surfaces, so that when we put on our base gasket like this, then it doesn't interfere. There's a couple of locator pins. Push those down without tearing the gasket. Okay. Now what I like to do as well is I like to put liberal amounts of engine oil or penetrating oil just to help things slide along on the cylinder, in the cylinder and inside the ring lands, as well as on the piston. And then you can either use a spring compressor tool or you can just use good old fingers like I'm going to do here and just squeeze these in and take your time here because you don't want to break one of these rings because that would be just terrible. If you feel any kind of resistance, I mean, you're going to get resistance from the rings, but if it doesn't go in just like it did, I would say you've got a problem with one of the rings and you might want to revisit that. Go back in and check, make sure that you haven't bent one or inadvertently broken one. Next, we're going to install the two chains. I've already gone ahead and put this one in place, but I'm going to show you how I put this one in here. Just going to drop it down, follow it out through here, over the tip of the crankshaft, and then right into its home. There we go, right there. I like to keep a little bit of pressure on it like that. I know some guys like to hang a magnet on the end of this. I avoid doing that because I don't like to magnetize any part of my engine inside, because that way there, junk and debris can get stuck onto it and just continue to wear or accelerate it. Then we're going to drop in our chain guide. Now we know that the chain isn't going to fall in place. Then we're going to install our third guide down below. Just right over here. Push that in place. We don't want that to come out. Just like that. Alright. Now we're going to move on to taking out the valve seals and reseating the valves, replacing them with new valve seals, and putting those heads onto the engine. So this next step isn't necessarily a must do. However, underneath the valve springs, right at the tip of the valve, right inside there, there's these little guys. And these are valve stem seals, as the package would tell us. I like to remove the spring in order to gain access to these seals and replace them. Like I said, you don't really need to do this part, but I do it because it comes in the kit, and it also prevents future oil consumption problems, because over time these seals tend to get hard. They turn into what I like to describe as plastic, and they leak, and then oil will follow right down the stem of the seal, or sorry, the valve, and it will make its way into the combustion chamber and get burnt off. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove the pin that holds the rocker, and then from there that will gain access to the valves. And I'm going to compress the spring using one of these contraptions, which actually works very well. This is an automotive style tool for doing this exact same job, but once you have it set, it works pretty good. Now we just go over the valve this way and then compress the spring and then go from there. Alright, now that we have access to the top of the valves, it's time to compress them. I'm only going to go as far as I need. I'm going to rest the tool just right on the side there. And with a small screwdriver, we're going to remove the two keepers. Remember, only go as far as you need, that way there you're not going to damage the spring. There we go, there's one. And there's two. Again, I try not to magnetize any of my components. And these little guys are super small, as you can tell. So you don't want to lose it. So keep a very close eye on where it might go. And it's also a good idea to make sure that the floor around you where you're working is clean. That way there, if it happens to fall onto the ground, you can see it. So let's get all 8 valves done, and then we'll move on to sticking these heads onto the engine. Oh, and I almost forgot. After removing the old seal, I also like to lap the valves with a little bit of grinding compound, just a very slight grind, just to help things seal up. So what I do, take the compound and put just a tiny bit on the face of the valve like that, all the way around. I'm going to put it back into its home, and I'm just going to rub it back and forth a little bit, just to clean up those two mating surfaces, make sure we have a nice tight seal. We're not going to lose compression that way. So just like that. Then we're going to actually see if I wipe this clean. I don't like to go too crazy. Once we wipe this clean, we can actually see where the two surfaces are mating, which is a good thing. Don't forget that before you move on, you clean up all that those grindings and the lapping compound from both the valve and the seat, because you don't want to leave it there. It will wear out your valves and your seats extremely fast. Now that we've got the valves resealed with new valve stem seals, it's time to flip the case on its side and install our side cover. So we're going to install our seal or our gasket first. I've already taken the liberty of jumping ahead and putting all the proper gears in the proper place, which is basically the reverse of taking it apart. So if you guys take pictures, or if you take a quick video for yourself, when you're putting it back together, it usually helps quite a bit. I've installed a new seal. I'm going to put a little bit of engine assembly lube onto the bearing, because I like to make sure that nothing runs dry upon startup. Okay, one final check before installing the cover, making sure all the gears are in place, because I almost had forgotten my oil pump gear. Everything's in good shape here. Alright, cover's clean. And into its place it goes. Just like that. Now we can go ahead and torque all the bolts. So before we can put the heads onto the engine, we need to make sure everything is kind of timed appropriately, because we're going to do the rear cylinder first. Then we're going to rotate the engine clockwise to the front cylinder. we're going to put on the magneto cover. We're going to make sure everything's nice and clean. And I like to dab a tiny bit of RTV just to hold the gasket in place while I'm working. Easier. And by the way, guys, comment below, tell me if you know what RTV stands for. I'll give you a second to think about it while I play around with this gasket. Anybody know? Well, as far as I know, RTV stands for room temperature vulcanizing. Kind of makes sense, right? I mean, okay, so now that we're happy that the magneto is, and starter gear is clean, we're going to line it up with the key. And I like to put a little bit of thread locker onto these bolts because, again, I wouldn't want this to fly loose on me. And this bolt is on with a H14 or Allen 14. Just so. Hold it. We are ready to put our cover on. And remember, if you recall pulling this apart, this thing is magnetized, so it's going to want to suck itself in. So just try and line it up as close as you can first before you end up getting too far. And watch your fingers as well. This thing's actually pretty powerful. There we go. Okay, now that we have the cover in place, at this point I like to rotate the engine to top dead center. But in order to do that properly, we need to remove the sensor, crankshaft sensor here. And right down here we are going to look for a mark 1-1 for the rear cylinder. And there's our mark 1-1. So I rotated the engine clockwise to get here, being cautious of the chains, making sure they weren't getting binded up. Now with the cylinder head mating surface nice and clean, same as the cylinder base nice and clean, we install our gasket, and now we're ready to set the head to its home. It's about time. Been a long time coming for this thing. Grab a hold of the chain and just torque these up first. These are going to have 3 torques. They're going to be 15 foot-pounds, 30 foot-pounds, and finally 40 foot-pounds. So the head's all torqued up now. We still have our marks 1-1, so for the rear cylinder. And at this point here, what you're looking for when it comes to the timing is you see these 2 marks up here, and they're flush. If I turn my camera, they are flush with the head here. That's what you're looking for there. We're going to tighten up that bolt, and we're going to turn the engine clockwise until we see 1-2, which will mean the front cylinder will be at the top dead center, and we're going to repeat the process there. Alright, so the front head, I've got this engine turned around right now, so this is the front head. Is all bolted up, torqued down. We've got the same markings facing the cylinder head here, but how do you really know if you've actually rotated it the proper way? One sure way of knowing is when you look back at the rear cylinder. Now we're looking at the rear cylinder here. These markings now are facing the ground. They're level with what would be the ground. So that's something to look for if you're... So I was just about to install the rocker cover when it occurred to me that it would probably be a good idea to adjust the valve clearance now. Probably much easier to do it now than to do it in the engine, or sorry, in the frame. So again, just run your feeler gauge underneath, check the specs, then go ahead and put your valve cover on. Alright, now we're moving on to the through shaft. So I've already installed a new seal with our holder. This cap actually gets a little bit of RTV all around. So now we're going to take the shaft, guide it all the way through. Let's see if we can get it to come out right there. Okay, next up we have our intake. Finally getting to the top of the engine. So I've installed new gaskets. Slide this in place. One of these slides down a little bit. Right. Next up we have our thermostat housing. So we've got new seals on this as well. This thing's kind of funky, it goes in between the V here, just like that. And I just realized something, it's kind of nice because I've only used a couple of sockets. I mean, mostly a number 8 mil and a 10 mil. Okay. Running low on parts in my bin. That's a good sign. Very good sign. I'm going to pop the dipstick back in here so that we don't have any junk or foreign debris make its way in. And here is the transmission. Now, this transmission obviously bolts up right here. But before we go ahead and do that, let's make sure we install a new seal. Because there's nothing worse than going through all this work and finding out that a simple O-ring is leaking and you got to open up everything once more. Let's slide this in place. Just like butter. Finally, we are going to install our last component for tonight because it's getting a little bit late and I'm sure my wife's going to be pretty angry with me before I get in bed. Alright guys, that's it for this video. We've got our Can Am 500 Outlander engine all back together. Be sure to follow me in the next video where I put this into the frame, fire it up for the first time and see if all that work was actually worth it. Thanks again for watching. If you liked the video, you guys know what to do. See you guys next time.